Imagine this, let's make a bold assumption. Is it possible that as soon as you buy a new stock, its price plummets? After a difficult period of volatility and decline, you can't take it anymore and decide to sell this losing stock. As a result, the stock price immediately surges, rising for several consecutive days. Have you ever suspected that the stock fell because you bought it? And that it was precisely because of your special one magic power that it rose again right after you sold it? To explain your magical power, this episode, we're going to explore an ultimate question: what is the nature of causality? All scientific research is built on the foundation of causality. But what is causality itself? This question, it can be said, remains a fiercely debated philosophical problem to this day. Does causality exist in this world? Is causality an objective existence in the world, or is it something subjectively constructed by us humans? It's not just scientific research, all aspects of our lives are also built on the foundation of causality. We all believe that everything happens for a reason, right? We always like to ask why. Why are my grades not good enough? Why am I overweight? Why did the price of the stock I bought fall? So why do we always love to ask why? It's to find the cause. Once we find the cause, we can take targeted measures to improve our lives. Are your poor grades due to the wrong study methods, or is it a problem with your attitude towards learning? Are you overweight because you eat too much, or because you move too little? Did the stock price fall due to a technical adjustment, or did it fall precisely because you bought it? Right, only after finding the correct cause can you make changes to address it. But the problem is there really a necessary connection between the cause you painstakingly found and the problem you want to solve? We say A is the cause of B, but is there really an objectively existing, necessary connection between these two? When A appears, will it inevitably lead to B also appearing? Could the connection between them just be a psychological illusion we've created? Many philosophers and statisticians now believe that causality is not an objective law of the world, but rather a subjective psychological habit we have formed. Even, there might be no discernible pattern at all between this cause and effect. The mainstream big data science of today has already given up on finding causes. Right, it's the so-called only look at correlation, don't ask about causation. As long as our statistics show that two things often appear together, you don't need to ask if there's a causal relationship between them. That's something we can't be clear about. For example, statistics find that people who go to the supermarket to buy diapers also like to buy beer. Is there a causal relationship between these two? I don't know, and there's no need to know. As the supermarket owner, you just need to put the beer and diapers together. This stance of only looking at correlation, not asking about causation, if taken to the extreme, on a philosophical level, even has some parallels with an ancient occasionalism. What is occasionalism? It says, you see on a billiard table, the white ball hits the black ball, and then the black ball moves. But you cannot say that the white ball, as the cause, led to the black ball moving. Instead, there is a higher power, whether you call it God or something else, who, on the one hand, makes the white ball move to the black ball's position, and on the other hand, makes the black ball move. It's not just billiards. Occasionalism believes that all things in the world are like this. There is no such thing as a causing B, no causal relationships exist between any two things in the world. The movement and change of all things are independent, separately adjusted by this higher power. So if we are doing scientific research, we shouldn't study the causal relationships between things. We should just study correlations. But, artificial intelligence can only look at correlation, not ask about causation. But can we humans also live normally by abandoning causal thinking? For example, you are holding a bouquet of roses and confessing your feelings to a girl on Valentine's Day. The girl asks you, "Why are you confessing to me?" You reply, "Because I like you, I want to be with you, so I am confessing to you." Right, this is our original, causal worldview. But, at this moment, a philosopher and a statistician run over and tell you, there is no causation in this world, only correlation. You should answer the girl like this, "I don't know why." According to statistical research, confessing to a girl with a bouquet of roses on Valentine's Day has a positive correlation with the girl accepting the confession. Congratulations, young man, you have mastered big data thinking. Whether it's occasionalism or those big data analyses, they are, in a sense, intellectually abandoning our pursuit of causality. The former appeals to a mysterious power like God, while the latter simply doesn't ask about causation at all. If we are unwilling to accept such a worldview that ignores causation, we need to figure out, based on reason, what exactly is the nature of causality. And in this episode of Big Questions, we will try to sort out this philosophical and scientific superproblem. A quick heads up, this superproblem really can't be explained in just a few words, so this episode will be over an hour long. Our answer to this big question today spans ancient and modern times, and also spans multiple different disciplines, crossing philosophy, natural science, statistics, logic, and computer science. In this episode, the representatives who will next appear to answer what is causality include the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who advocated for inherent causality in the world, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who argued causality is subjective psychological association, the German philosopher Kant, who claimed causality is a human cognitive structure, the American philosopher and logician David Lewis, who proposed causality as a counterfactual conditional, and the American philosopher and computer scientist Judea Pearl, who asserted causality can be written into code. This episode will introduce the views of these 5 philosophers on what is causality, and ultimately, you will need to judge whose view is more reasonable. Okay, let's get to the main feature. First, let's welcome the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. When talking about what causality is, we cannot bypass the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, as the great synthesizer of ancient philosophy and ancient science, his view of causality, to a large extent, set the tone for the development of later philosophy and science. Aristotle believed that natural philosophy, as a field of study, its main subject is the study of the causes of things. And this natural philosophy was the predecessor of modern natural science. In Aristotle's view, the primary task of natural philosophy is to understand the origins and causes of all natural things. Aristotle emphasized that to know a thing, one must know its cause. And knowing the cause means we understand its nature. Aristotle believed, knowing the cause means knowing the nature of the thing, which means that the cause of a thing's existence and its changes in motion comes from its nature. This means that causality is inherent in the things of this world. It is a structure and order that the world itself possesses. So what exactly is the cause of a thing? In Aristotle's view, when we ask what the cause of a thing is, we are actually asking about these 4 kinds of things. This is Aristotle's famous 4 causes. The first cause, then, is the material cause, which answers the question, what is it made of? Hey, it's the material that constitutes the thing. For example, the material cause of a statue is material like marble or bronze. Without such a material, the formation of the statue would be impossible. Second, the formal cause, which answers the question, what is the structure or essence that makes it what it is, and not something else? For example, the formal cause of a statue is the design blueprint in the artisan's mind. Third, the efficient cause, which answers the question, what is the immediate agent that moves it from a state of potentiality to a state of actuality? Simply put, what makes this thing move? The efficient cause of the statue is the sculptor and his tools, and it is they who carve the potential image out of the stone, bit by bit. Fourth, the final cause, which answers the question, what is the purpose of its existence? And this point reflects where Aristotle differs from modern science, which is Aristotle's teleological worldview. Aristotle believed that the existence of anything always has a certain purpose. For an artifact like a statue, for example, the final cause of the statue is why was this statue made? Perhaps it's to commemorate a hero, or to beautify a courtyard, and so on. The purpose of such artifacts, then, is given to it by humans. But natural objects, although no one has assigned them a final cause, natural objects also have their own inherent final cause. For example, the roots of a plant grow downward to absorb water and nutrients, and the leaves stretch upward to absorb sunlight. The woodpecker grows a hard, slender beak to peck wood, the fish grows a streamlined body to swim, and so on and so forth. Anyway, all things are inherently purposeful. However, after the scientific revolution in the modern era, that is, after Galileo, Newton, and others developed classical mechanics, these scientists, then, established a mechanistic worldview, and thus, they abandoned Aristotle's teleological worldview. The final cause among Aristotle's 4 causes was regarded by later scientists as an unnecessary metaphysical component. Scientists, then, only paid attention to the efficient cause among the four causes proposed by Aristotle, right? This is the force in Newtonian mechanics. But no matter how modern scientists rejected Aristotle's teleology, on one point, they still inherited Aristotle's view of causality. That is, causality is inherent in the things of this world. Causality is objectively existing. Right? Newtonian mechanics tells us that force is the cause of the change in an object's state of motion. Ball A hits ball B, causing ball B to change its state of motion, so A is the cause of B. To be precise, the force exerted by A is the cause of the change in B's state of motion. And this force therein is what Aristotle called the efficient cause. This force is genuine and real. In words we often use today, this kind of causal relationship is independent of human will. Moreover, just like Aristotle's view, modern scientists also believed, the task of science is to find the causes of things. Scientific research is to find the causal laws between things. Then, after finding the causal laws therein, we can predict the movement and development of things. This is what modern science calls the ability to find causes, make predictions right. Newtonian mechanics allows us, while hiding in a small dark room, to accurately predict the trajectory of objects thousands of miles away. Hailed as the French Newton, the 19th-century French astronomer and mathematician Laplace was full of confidence in this find causes, make predictions ability of Newtonian mechanics. Laplace proclaimed, the movement and change of all things in the universe are nothing more than the product of interacting forces. The present state of all things is the result of their past state, and also the cause of their future state. So if there were a superintelligent being who could know the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a specific moment, then for this being, the future of the universe would be laid out before him, complete, just like the past. It means there is nothing uncertain in the universe. The movement and change of all things in the universe could be accurately predicted by this being. Posterity calls the omniscient being described by Laplace Laplace's demon. The proposal of Laplace's demon implies that many scientists, including Laplace, were full of confidence in science's ability to find causes, make predictions. The philosophical assumption behind this confidence is very clear, that is, causality is objective and exists independently of human will. And the task of science, then, is to discover these objectively existing causal laws in nature. This is the stance of causal realism that was passed down in a continuous line from Aristotle to Newton, and then to Laplace. It was precisely under the influence of this causal realism stance, then, that in the 18th century, the entire scientific community was brimming with a kind of deterministic optimism. Scientists believed that as long as we have enough precise instruments and models, and grasp enough information, we can, like Laplace's demon, foresee everything and control everything. However, just as the 18th century scientists were rejoicing, at this time, a philosopher in Scotland named David Hume threw a basin of cold water. He said, "You all, whether it's Aristotle or the scientists after the modern scientific revolution, have misunderstood causality. In fact, causality is not objectively existing, and the predictions that scientific knowledge makes about the movement and development of things are also not universally necessary." Okay, next, let's welcome the Scottish philosopher David Hume. If everyone here knows a little about Western philosophy, you'll know that the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume deconstructed the objectivity and necessity of causality. Hume believed that causality is not objectively existing. Hume's deconstruction of causality was truly deafening. Even today's philosophers and scientists have to face Hume's challenge to causality. So how did Hume deconstruct causality? First, Hume divided all human knowledge into two categories. Hume's classification of knowledge is called Hume's fork. Hume believed human knowledge is divided into two types. The first is knowledge about relations of ideas, and the second is knowledge about matters of fact. The first type, relations of ideas, is actually knowledge in mathematics and logic. This kind of mathematical and logical knowledge doesn't involve any empirical facts, it's purely logical reasoning between concepts. For example, 2 plus 3 is equal to 5, or if A is greater than B, and B is greater than C, then A is necessarily greater than C, right? This kind of mathematical and logical knowledge is universally necessary, it's black and white, with no ambiguity at all. To study this kind of knowledge, you don't even need to go outside. You can hide in your own little dark room and, through logical reasoning, deduce the entire edifice of mathematics. Because their negation would lead to an internal logical contradiction. This is to say, we don't need empirical observation, we can study this knowledge just by analyzing the concepts themselves. Right, no matter where you are, whether you're from London or Tokyo, no matter which country you're from, 2 plus 3 still equals 5. Even if aliens came, they would have to take the same math test as us. Okay, the second type of knowledge, then, is scientific knowledge, including natural sciences and social sciences. This is knowledge about matters of fact. The major difference between this scientific knowledge and mathematical knowledge is that studying scientific knowledge requires observing empirical facts. Right, scientists have to do experiments. You can't just hide in a small darkroom and deduce things to publish a scientific paper. And what is this scientific knowledge about matters of fact? It is, in fact, knowledge about the causal relationships between things. Hume said, this second type of knowledge about matters of fact, that is, causality, is not universally necessary. Hey, why say that? Hey, let's use an example. You observe that the sun comes out, and then the stone gets hot. Hey, so you believe it's the sun's rays that cause the stone to get hot. The sun's rays are the cause, the stone getting hot is the effect. Right, you've derived a law of physics, the sun heats stones. Of course, if you want to be more granular, you'd say that the thermal energy emitted by the sun accelerates the movement of the molecules that make up the stone. But Hume would ask, the sun came out, the stone got hot, is there any necessary connection between these two facts? When you say because the sun came out, therefore the stone got hot, is there any logical necessity between this cause and effect? There isn't. Because its negation does not lead to an internal logical contradiction. For example, we can completely imagine, the sun came out, and then the stone got cold. It's entirely possible, there's no logical contradiction at all. So, since there is no necessary connection between cause and effect, how is the link between cause and effect formed? Hume said, the so-called connection between cause and effect is just a psychological, habitual association that arises based on the induction of empirical facts. What is induction of empirical facts? It's that I observe every time the sun comes out, and then I discover, hey, this stone gets hot along with it. I've observed it 10,000 times, and it's like this every time, and every time we take out our little notebook and write it down. And this little notebook, then, represents that we've formed a habit. And then, when the 10,001st time we see the sun come out, hey, at this moment, we review our little notebook, and our mind creates an association, associating that this time, the stone will probably get hot too. This means that when we observe event A happening n times, it is accompanied by event B happening. When this number n becomes large enough, we psychologically come to believe that when event A happens the n plus 1 th time, the probability of event B also happening becomes even greater. But, having said that, no matter how high the probability, it's still just a probability. This is just an induction formed after we keep recording in our little notebook. Induction does not have necessity. Because it's entirely possible that when event A happens the n plus 2 th time, event B doesn't happen at all. Right, it's entirely possible that the next time the sun comes out, the stone gets cold. Don't think that the sun comes out, the stone gets cold is an absurd idea. A classic real-life example is, before Europeans discovered Australia, all the swans they saw were white. They saw 100 swans, 10,000 swans, and 1 million swans, all of them white, without exception. And so, hey, European scientists wrote down a scientific law in their little notebooks, which is, all swans are white. Nothing wrong with that, right? A scientific law, right? Universally necessary, right? But, once Europeans went to Australia and discovered that there were actually black swans, their entire worldview just shattered. Let's take another example everyone has heard of, which is the turkey theory proposed by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, also known as the farmer hypothesis that Liu Cixin wrote into the three-body problem. It says, there is a flock of turkeys on a farm, and the farmer comes to feed the turkeys at 11 a.m. every day. Among these turkeys, there is one scientist, a turkey scientist, who observes this phenomenon, and observes it for nearly a year without any exceptions. Thus, he declares that he has discovered a great law of his universe, which is, food arrives every day at 11 a.m. He announced this great law to the turkeys on the morning of Thanksgiving. But, at 11 a.m. on Thanksgiving Day, no food arrived. Instead, the farmer came in, caught the turkeys, and killed them all. What this means is, the causal relationships between facts that we derive based on the induction of experience are not universally necessary. We can never avoid the appearance of the next black swan. Hume believed, it's not that there is some universal, necessary, objective law that dictates when the sun comes out, the stone must get hot. Rather, it's just based on our psychological habit. Right, we are used to it, right? We are used to seeing the sun come out, and then mentally associating that the stone will get hot. Just like we are used to seeing a cup fall off a table, and then mentally associating that it will shatter. We have never directly experienced causality itself. We only see event B always appearing after event A, and thus habitually assume that A caused B. This means that between things, there isn't necessarily any objective causal relationship. Causality is subjectively constructed. Just like that, Hume deconstructed the objectivity and necessity of causality. This can be considered a subversive view in the history of philosophy. Hume's analysis, then, had an impact on people's view of causality that can be called devastating. As everyone knows, at that time, Newtonian mechanics was sweeping Europe. Everyone felt, as long as they found the right thing, like Aristotle's efficient cause, humanity would have found the objective laws of this world, and then humanity could predict all the changes in this world. But Hume said, the so-called cause of things you found is just a subjective human psychological association formed from the induction of experience. It is not an objective law of the world itself. The consequence of this view of Hume's was that people's trust in the objectivity and necessity of so-called scientific truth began to collapse. We spend so much effort conducting experiments, accumulating data, just to find repeatable, predictable causal relationships. But Hume reminds us, what you are doing is just discovering statistical patterns, not mastering some objective, necessary law. This is why later, when people say only look at correlation, don't ask about causation, they always have to mention Hume. It's that you see two variables always occurring at the same time, but it doesn't mean one is the cause of the other. Indeed, many later scientists were influenced by Hume, and simply concluded, scientific research doesn't need to focus on causality, it only needs to focus on correlation. The statistician Karl Pearson believed that scientific research is not about finding causes, but about describing the statistical correlations between phenomena. This means, then, that you, as a scientist, just need to take your little notebook and faithfully record what happened first, and what happened later. First, the sun came out, then the stone got hot. You just record it faithfully. As for whether there is a causal relationship between the two, that question is not important. You only need to focus on the correlation coefficient between things. The concept of the correlation coefficient was proposed by Pearson. The mainstream path of big data analysis today follows exactly this path, which is only look at correlation, don't ask about causation. We also mentioned this classic case at the beginning, that statistical research found that customers who buy diapers in the supermarket are more likely to buy beer. Between these two, there is a high correlation. But is there any causal relationship here? I don't know. Is it because young fathers are always sent to buy diapers? Or is it because most people who drink beer are fathers of newborns? I don't know, and there's no need to know. Based on correlation alone, we can guide the supermarket owner's actions, which is, put the diapers and beer on the shelf together, and sales will increase. That's enough. Let's go back to Hume. Hume deconstructed the objectivity and necessity of causality, believing that the idea of causality is just a subjective, habitual association. Of course, Hume did not deny the usefulness of this concept of causality. Just as we said, although correlation doesn't equal causation, correlation is enough to guide our actions. Hume also admitted, if we were to doubt every day, will fire suddenly stop burning people? If I drink wine, will I suddenly not get drunk? Then we couldn't live at all, right? Although the idea of causality is just a habitual association, if people are to live normally, they must still follow the power of habit. In Hume's own words, habit is the great guide of human life. Hume's deconstruction of causality was not to deny the utility of people's concept of causality. But as a philosopher, after all, Hume found it necessary to point out, in theory, between logic and experience, there is an unbridgeable gap. Any causal relationship that is based on empirical observation and derived from induction is not objective and necessary. This is Hume's view of causality. Against the backdrop of Newtonian mechanics sweeping Europe and the rapid advancement of science, Hume unexpectedly threw a basin of cold water from a philosophical standpoint, shattering the belief left by Aristotle that causality is the inherent order of the world. Hume's deconstruction of causality, then, not only challenged the mainstream consensus of the scientific community at the time, but also deeply shocked another philosopher of the same era, and that is Kant. Kant was 13 years younger than Hume, and when he read Hume's works, it was as if he were struck by lightning. His worldview collapsed. Causality doesn't exist anymore. In Kant's own words, it was, "Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumber." Kant began to realize that if causality is just a psychological habit, then all scientific knowledge based on causal reasoning, that is, all physical laws, all natural laws, will lose their universal necessity. In that case, the entire edifice of science would lose its philosophical foundation, reduced to a pile of empirical materials. In that case, physics would truly become worthless. In that era of great scientific development, how can the universal necessity of scientific knowledge be possible, became the biggest problem Kant faced, and also the most challenging philosophical legacy Hume left him. From this, Kant began his own philosophical path. He had to respond head-on to the challenge posed by Hume. Kant wanted, in that era of great scientific development, to lay the philosophical foundation for the universal necessity of scientific knowledge. Okay, next, let's welcome the German philosopher Kant. Even friends who haven't taken a philosophy class know that Kant is one of the most influential philosophers since modern times. And this great philosopher was able to develop his own philosophical theory precisely because he was provoked by Hume. A major effort of Kant's philosophy was to respond to Hume's challenge to causality. It can be said, whether Kant successfully responded to Hume's problem determines whether Kant's philosophy can stand. How did Kant respond to Hume's challenge? Kant used a receive, neutralize, and counter approach. That is, to first accept Hume's view, saying, "Yes, yes, yes, what you said is right." Thus, he neutralizes the attack of Hume's challenge. And then, with a slight, skillful shift, he issues his own view, different from Hume's. Okay, let's first talk about where Kant agreed with Hume. Hume believed that causality is not objectively existing. Because in the empirical world, we have never directly observed causality itself. What we observe is, event B always appears after event A. Thus, we subjectively construct that A is the cause of B. Kant said, "Hey, that's right. Causality is not objectively existing. Causality, indeed, is subjectively constructed by us humans." No problem. Even, Kant went further than Hume. It's not just that the causal relationship between things is subjectively constructed by humans. Kant believed that all our knowledge about things is not inherent in the things themselves, it is all subjectively constructed by humans. For example, when we see an apple in front of us, I can perceive its red color through my vision, I can feel its smooth texture and its weight through my sense of touch, I can taste its sweet and sour flavor through my sense of taste. The question is, this color, texture, weight, flavor of the apple that we perceive, are they inherent in the apple itself? Is this apple itself red? Kant believed it is not. These properties of the apple, like color, texture, flavor, are subjectively constructed by us humans. Because we humans have unique sensory and cognitive structures. These properties of the apple, like color, texture, flavor, are only perceived after passing through our unique human sensory and cognitive structures. This perception of the apple is, of course, subjectively constructed by humans. Kant called this subjective construction, this perception of the apple obtained by passing through our unique human cognitive structures, phenomena or appearances. But setting aside these subjectively constructed phenomena, if you ask me again, if you insist on asking me, what is the objective essence of the apple? If we detach from our human sensory and cognitive structures, what is this apple in itself? Then this question cannot be answered. Asking what the apple is in itself is like asking a blind person what kind of color is red, both are meaningless. Kant called this thing in itself, Ding in sich in German. We can only know the phenomena that are subjectively constructed by us when the thing in itself stimulates our senses in cognitive forms. As for this thing in itself, we cannot make any description of it. The thing in itself cannot be known, the thing in itself is unknowable. So, under this maneuver by Kant, let's go back to Hume's challenge to causality. Kant certainly also believed, causality is also a subjective construction of the human cognitive structure, it only exists in the world of phenomena. This causal relationship is not inherent in the thing in itself. Only we humans can perceive causal relationships between things. If you switch to another species with a completely different cognitive structure, say, an insect, the world it perceives would have no causal relationships. Causality is, of course, subjectively constructed by humans. Okay, this is where Kant agreed with Hume, causality is a human subjective construction. Kant even went further than Hume, all knowledge is subjectively constructed. But next, Kant is about to point out where he disagrees with Hume. Remember at the end of the last part, an important task of Kant's philosophy. That is, to lay the foundation for the universal necessity of scientific knowledge. Hume believed that scientific knowledge is built on causal reasoning, and causal reasoning is just a subjective construction, therefore, scientific knowledge does not possess universal necessity. But Kant believed, even if scientific knowledge built on causal reasoning is subjectively constructed, it still possesses universal necessity. Hey, how can it be both subjectively constructed and possess universal necessity? Hey, let's look step by step at how Kant linked subjectivity and universal necessity together. If you've taken a philosophy class, you'll know Hume is a philosopher from the British empiricism camp. What is empiricism? Simply put, our mind, from this world observes and receives empirical facts, and it receives them just as they are, it doesn't add drama to the empirical materials. A typical doctrine is the blank slate theory proposed by the British philosopher John Locke, who also belongs to the empiricism camp. It says our mind is like a clean blank slate, with no marks on it, like a clean mirror. Our knowledge of all things in the world is just the raw accumulation of empirical materials. Whatever empirical facts are out there, we will accept them all as they are, without processing them at all. So, it is precisely in this sense, advocated by empiricism, of accepting empirical materials as they are, without processing them at all, that Hume raised the soul-searching question, in these empirical materials we've collected, where is there any causality? What we observe is merely event B always appearing after event A, and nothing more. But, Kant believed, the human mind is not a blank slate, but comes with its own pre-processing programs. That is, when we accept empirical facts, we don't just accept them as they are, but rather, as we are accepting the empirical materials, we are already processing them as we accept them. The experiences we receive are all already processed experiences. Just like the apple example we gave earlier. We cannot know the apple itself, we can only know the phenomena generated when the apple itself stimulates our cognitive structure. And this process of the thing in itself passing through our cognitive structure is precisely the process of our mind's pre-processing programs processing the empirical materials. And what are these pre-processing programs? Kant called them forms of cognition. In his book Critique of Pure Reason, Kant conducted a detailed analysis of our cognitive structure. He divided the human cognitive structure into a three-layer structure: sensibility, understanding, and reason. Sensibility provides the raw materials. This is similar to what the empiricists called the raw empirical materials we accept as they are. They are the chaotic, disorganized empirical materials we perceive through our senses. For example, hearing the sound of a cup hitting the floor, seeing water spilled all over the ground. The understanding, then, is like a processing factory, responsible for integrating these materials into comprehensible phenomena. The processing programs here, that is, the forms of cognition, use the so-called categories of understanding. And among these is the category of causality. Reason, then, operates at a higher level, further stringing these appearances into principles and systems. For example, our understanding of natural laws and moral laws. So, causality is constructed at the understanding level, within the sensibility, understanding, reason framework, by this cognitive category of causality. This category of causality is a way for the understanding to organize and process time sequences. It puts a string in our minds, that everything has a cause, and allows us to understand things that happen later in time as being caused by things that happened earlier. Without cognitive categories like causality, we couldn't form any understanding of this world at all. This world would just be a chaotic mess to us. For example, hey, I see a cup fall to the ground, then it shatters, and water spills all over the place. Ah, we say, because the cup fell to the ground, therefore it shattered. This isn't an association we summarize after observing 100 or 10,000 cups falling and shattering. Rather, it is that in the very instant we observe the cup falling, we are observing it through the category of causality. Without this category of causality, all our sensory impressions would just be a scattered multitude of chaos. It's just, how did this cup fall to the ground? And then how did it just shatter? How did the water just spill all over the ground? We can't understand it. We can't feel any connection between these sequential events. It's like it doesn't matter what happened first or last. It's just a chaotic mess. To use watching a video as an analogy, if we weren't watching the video with the inherent category of causality, we would only be able to see individual, isolated frames, and couldn't form a complete video of a cup falling to the ground and shattering. So, causality, indeed, does not objectively exist within the world, but is a necessary form of cognition for us to understand the world. Kant called these forms of cognition, what we are calling pre-processing programs here, a priori. Meaning, they are prior to empirical material, and are the preconditions that make our understanding of experience possible. To use an analogy, we humans view the world with this built-in filter of the category of causality. It's like every one of us, from birth, has been welded with a pair of glasses, and as long as we look at the world through these glasses, all things in the world are imbued with causality. Therefore, we do not discover causality from the external world, as Aristotle claimed. Nor do we, as Hume said, associate causality as a habit after inducing from empirical facts. We, in the very act of knowing the world, are knowing the world using this pre-processing program called the category of causality. Causality does not come from experience, I'll say it again. It is the precondition that makes our understanding of experience possible. Okay, having said that, we can now reveal why Kant could, on the one hand, believe that causality is subjectively constructed, and on the other hand, also believe that this subjectively constructed causality is also universally necessary. Why? Because this set of human forms of cognition, this set of pre-processing programs, this pair of filters for knowing the world, is the same for all humanity. All humans have the same mental structure. Right as the saying goes, people share this mind, and the mind shares this reason. We all use the same category of causality filter to know the world. This is equivalent to, everyone uses a Type-C interface to receive information from the world. Since this interface is standardized, then, isn't the underlying format of causality that people receive the same? So no matter where you are, whether you're from London or Tokyo, no matter which country you're from, all humans use the same causality filter to know the world. If aliens come, whether they have the same causality filter, we can't say. But as long as you are a human, you cannot take off this causality filter. So in Kant's view, the universal necessity of scientific knowledge based on causal reasoning is not based on its objectivity in the world of the thing in itself, but is based on intersubjectivity. That is, the a priori cognitive forms between people are the same. Right, everyone has the same set of pre-processing programs. Therefore, the understanding of the world generated based on the same set of pre-processing programs can reach a consensus among people. So in this sense, Kant also called this intersubjectivity a kind of objectivity. Okay, after talking about Kant establishing universal necessity for scientific knowledge based on intersubjectivity, you might be wondering, how can consensus between subjects be called universally necessary? Will subjects necessarily reach this consensus? Yes. In Kant's view, this so-called consensus will necessarily be reached, because it is an a priori consensus. This brings us to Kant's doctrine of how are synthetic a priori judgments possible. Didn't Hume divide all human knowledge into two types? One is called knowledge about relations of ideas, which is mathematical and logical knowledge. The other, then, is knowledge about matters of fact, which is scientific knowledge built on causal reasoning. Hume believed only the first type of knowledge is universally necessary. And the second type of knowledge, because it is all induced from empirical facts, is therefore not universally necessary. So Kant, also roughly adopted Hume's classification, and then tried to use magic to defeat magic. Kant also divided all knowledge into two categories. Kant called them two types of judgments, because knowledge is all about judgments. One is called analytic judgments, and the other is called synthetic judgments. Analytic judgments are where the predicate is contained within the subject. The predicate, then, is analyzed from the subject. For example, a tautology, all bachelors are unmarried men. Or a logical identity like A equals A. Such analytic judgments, then, possess universal necessity. The universal necessity of analytic judgments depends on their a priori nature. A priori here means prior to experience. It means, regardless of whether the empirical world is collapsing or the seas dry up, whether you are in London or on another planet, A still equals A. But, this analytic judgment does not add any new content to our knowledge. So it doesn't count as knowledge in the strict sense. The second type, synthetic judgments, then, refers to where the predicate is not contained within the subject. This adds new content, right? So this is knowledge. For example, the sun heats the stone. Write this fact: the stone is hot. We cannot analyze from the definition of the sun. We must observe empirical facts to arrive at such a judgment. Therefore, synthetic judgments, then, are a posteriori. The a posteriori Kant speaks of here means derived from experience, that is, it can only be obtained through empirical observation. But, it is precisely based on this point that Hume believed this knowledge derived from a posteriori empirical observation, then, is not universally necessary. So in this sense, Hume deconstructed the universal necessity of causality. But Kant then stood up and said, Hume, the kind of knowledge you're talking about is just an a posteriori synthetic judgment. Causality is not this kind of a posteriori synthetic judgment. Causality, it is a synthetic a priori judgment. You hear this and think, what synthetic a priori judgment? This a priori nature, isn't that something only analytic judgments can have? Aren't synthetic judgments all a posteriori? How can a synthetic judgment also be a priori? How is this synthetic a priori judgment possible? Kant said, why can synthetic judgments also be a priori? Its a priori nature depends on its transcendental nature. We've come full circle. Our forms of cognition are prior to experience and are the preconditions that make our empirical knowledge possible. A transcendental form of cognition is, of course, also a priori, prior to experience. And a priori nature also implies universal necessity. Therefore, scientific knowledge based on causal reasoning, as a synthetic judgment, is also a transcendental judgment, and therefore is also an a priori judgment, and therefore possesses universal necessity. Argument complete. I should explain again, in case you didn't understand. It's not that all synthetic judgments are a priori. For example, the sun heats the stone, that is an a posteriori synthetic judgment. And indeed, just as Hume said, this certainly does not possess universal necessity. Because it can be wrong. But causality is not this kind of a posteriori synthetic judgment. Rather, it's a judgment like everything that happens has a cause. This is a synthetic a priori judgment. First, its predicate is not contained within its subject. Right? We cannot analyze from the definition of everything that happens that it must have a cause. So, it provides new content. It is a synthetic judgment. Second, it does not depend on experience. It is a priori, transcendental. It is not a piece of knowledge we derive after observing nature. Rather, it is a pre-processing program that is inherent in our minds from birth. Therefore, it is a priori, innate. So, the sun indeed might not be the cause of the stone getting hot, but you cannot say that causality doesn't exist. Alright, Kant's doctrine of synthetic a priori judgments, we can only give a rough overview in this program, we can't go into more detail. Okay, back to the point. Kant's maneuver, then, laid the foundation of universal necessity for scientific knowledge based on causal reasoning, thereby responding to Hume's challenge to causality. Do you think Kant's response to Hume's challenge was successful? Did Kant perfectly resolve the doubts Hume raised? Okay, after introducing Kant's response to Hume. At this time, David Lewis, who is about to come on stage next, is getting a bit restless in the audience. This Lewis isn't just a philosopher, he's also a logician. Lewis says, "You pure philosophers are really boring. You've been arguing about what is the nature of causality for ages, saying causality is an a priori category in the human form of cognition, that causality is a synthetic a priori judgment. But what's the use of me knowing this definition of causality? Can it help me specifically understand the world and change the world?" Kant, here, said he wanted to lay the foundation for scientific knowledge. But can this view of causality you proposed effectively guide scientific research work? For example, your advisor asks you, is there a causal relationship between these two parameters? You answer, there is a synthetic a priori judgment in here. See if your advisor doesn't kill you. When we study causality, we should develop an operational definition of causality. Through this operational definition, then, we can specifically measure whether or not there is a causal relationship between two specific things. And this is the work of David Lewis, who is coming up next. Okay, let's welcome the American philosopher David Lewis. The definition Kant gave for causality is more of an ontological definition. But Lewis proposed giving causality an operational definition. That is, under what circumstances, can we say there is a causal relationship between two events? And under what circumstances can we say there is no causal relationship? In other words, what we need to know is, what counts as a causal relationship? Not what causality is in itself. This means, Lewis wants to provide a judgment model for causality. So how do we judge causality? Let's take a very everyday example. You were late for work today, and your boss asks you, "Why are you late?" You answer, "Because there was traffic on the road." Your boss questions, "Is the traffic on the road really the reason you were late for work?" Right? How do you determine that there's really a causal relationship between the traffic and you being late for work? At this time, Lewis would stand up and translate for you. What you mean when you say there is a causal relationship between the traffic and you being late for work, is actually, if there hadn't been traffic on the road, I wouldn't have been late. Right? This is the first step Lewis proposed for verifying the existence of causality. Convert the causal relationship to be verified into a logical counterfactual conditional. What is a counterfactual conditional? This counterfactual conditional talks about, although in reality, the event has already happened, but, we can imagine a hypothetical scenario of if it weren't like this, and then see if, in this scenario, that result would still happen. That is, if you want to verify if A is the cause of B, you go and imagine, if there were no A, would B still happen? If without A, there would be no B, then A is the cause of B. Let's go back to the traffic example. You want to verify if traffic on the road is the cause of you being late for work. You go and imagine another possible world. In that world, the road conditions are smooth, and there is no traffic. Then you would be able to arrive at the company on time. Right? The original result did not happen. So you can judge, traffic on the road is the reason you were late for work today. Just now we mentioned the concept of possible world. Trying to imagine another possible world, if there were no A, would there be B? In fact, we can understand possible world as a possibility. That is, on the way to work today, it's possible there is traffic, and also possible there isn't traffic. This means, in one possible world, there was traffic on the way to work. And in another, parallel possible world, there was no traffic on the way to work. To verify if A and B have a causal relationship in the actual world, you must appeal to another possible world. In this possible world, if A didn't happen, and B also didn't happen, then A and B have a causal relationship in this actual world. Note, this possible world we appeal to, must be the possible world that is closest to the actual world. What is meant by the closest possible world? It means, this possible world you are imagining, compared to the actual world you are in, it has fewer modified settings. In order to verify the cause of being late for work today, imagine a possible world like this. On the way to work, there are typhoons and earthquakes, and the Incredible Hulk even comes out to destroy traffic facilities. That's just too many confounding variables, you can't verify the cause. The closest possible world is, it in the actual world you are in, all other settings, are exactly the same. It's just there was no traffic on the way to work today. Simply put, you need to control for variables. So, with such a counterfactual conditional that appeals to the closest possible world, in our lives and scientific research activities, we can use it to verify causality. For example, does a new drug have a causal relationship with curing a disease? We can imagine two close possible worlds. A patient in one possible world takes this drug, and a patient in another possible world, with all other conditions the same, just doesn't take this drug. We then look to see if the patient's diseases in these two possible worlds are cured. This is the experimental group and control group we commonly use in medical experiments now. Now we know, by appealing to the counterfactual conditional of the closest possible world, we can verify whether two events have a causal relationship. It's also said, if there were no A, there would be no B, so Lewis calls this relationship between A and B counterfactual dependence. Lewis believed that as long as events have a counterfactual dependence relationship, they have a causal relationship. The essence of causality is counterfactual dependence. Okay, so now the question arises. In our lives, we will find that some two events that do not have a counterfactual dependence relationship actually do have a causal relationship. There's a classic case in philosophy called the preemption problem. It says, there are two mischievous kids, Susie and Bobby, and they are throwing rocks at the same window. Susie throws her rock first, the rock hits the glass, and the glass shatters. Bobby also throws his rock, it's just that his arm speed is a bit slower than Susie's, and by the time his rock flies to the window, hey, the glass has already been shattered by the rock Susie threw. Okay, now here's the question. Please tell me, is the event the glass shattered counterfactually dependent on Susie throwing the rock? Here you will find, it is not dependent. Because, if Susie hadn't thrown the rock, the glass would still have shattered. Because Bobby would have subsequently shattered the glass too. Right, therefore, there is no counterfactual dependence relationship between Susie throwing the rock and the glass shattering. But can you then say that Susie throwing the rock is not the cause of the glass shattering? We obviously cannot accept this conclusion. In fact, this was a bug in Lewis's early causal theory, or rather, a place where the theory was incomplete. After some scholars criticized this, hey, Lewis tried to patch this bug, of not having counterfactual dependence, but still having a causal relationship. How did he do it? He introduced the concept of a causal chain. That is, for two events that do not have direct counterfactual dependence, we must also examine, do they have an indirect counterfactual dependence relationship? It's said, we need to see if there are intermediate links between the two events, such that every adjacent pair of events on this chain does have a counterfactual dependence relationship. Let's use the preemption problem again. Event A, Susie throwing the rock, leads to event B, the glass shattered. Between these two events, we can insert an intermediate link C, Susie's rock flying towards the glass. Thus, a causal chain is formed. Okay, let's look at this causal chain now. We ask, is event C, Susie's rock flying towards the glass, counterfactually dependent on event A, Susie throwing the rock? The answer is, yes. If Susie hadn't thrown the rock, Susie's rock would not be flying towards the glass. Okay, let's ask again, is event B, the glass shattered, counterfactually dependent on event C, Susie's rock flying towards the glass? The answer is also, yes. If Susie's rock had not flown towards the glass would not have shattered at that moment, in that way. We see, on this causal chain, every step satisfies the counterfactual dependence condition. Therefore, even if we initially found that event B, the glass shattered, was not directly counterfactually dependent on event A, Susie throwing the rock, by having counterfactual dependence between adjacent nodes on this chain, we can still determine, Susie throwing the rock indeed is the cause of the glass shattering. There are many other examples like this, where the two ends of the causal chain do not have direct counterfactual dependence, but are linked by an indirect counterfactual dependence through the chain. And, the intermediate links, there can be more than one. For example, a rise in summer temperatures in a certain area leads to a decrease in crop yields, which then leads to a rise in staple food prices, which then leads to a change in residents' dietary structure, that is, eating fewer grains, which then leads to residents consuming less carbohydrates and a change in blood sugar levels. Although the events at the two ends of this chain, that is, rise in temperature and change in blood sugar, do not have counterfactual dependence, because even if the temperature hadn't risen, blood sugar could have changed for other reasons, right? But, if every adjacent pair of nodes on this chain has a counterfactual dependence relationship, then we can still say, rise in temperature is the cause of the change in blood sugar. Thus, by proposing the causal chain, Lewis patched the incompleteness of using counterfactual conditionals to define causality. So now, we can still say, the essence of causality is a relationship of counterfactual dependence. It's just that, some are a direct counterfactual dependence relationship between two things, and some are an indirect counterfactual dependence relationship connected by a causal chain. David Lewis's proposal of this theory, using counterfactual conditionals to explain causality, can be said to have shaken the academic world. Because he no longer just proposed conceptual definitions of causality that lacked operability, like the pure philosophers of the past. Lewis said, if there were no A, then there would be no B, therefore A and B have a causal relationship. This has operability, right? We can take this model and use it to verify whether there is a causal relationship between two specific things in the real world. But, although Lewis's proposal of this causal theory shook the academic world, it still faced a lot of criticism from academia. It's like, your Lewis causal theory emphasizes operability, but the most common criticism of this theory is still reflected in, this theory, in fact, isn't that operable. First, your counterfactual dependence is built on a theory of possible worlds. It's about finding that closest possible world, to see if it doesn't happen, whether B will happen. But the problem is, what exactly is the closest possible world? Who decides? How do you compare the similarity between two possible worlds? This judgment has neither objective standards nor practical methods of operation, it can only rely on subjective conjecture. For example, you ask, if I hadn't missed the subway, would I still have been late today? Lewis's meaning is, imagine a closest possible world, in that world, you didn't miss the subway, and then observe if you were late. But in reality, you'll find, did you miss the subway because you left home late? Or was it because the subway was delayed that you were late? Is it possible that in that world, you wouldn't even have left the house? Right, this can't be clearly stated. Which world is closer, highly depends on the intuition of different people. It's said to be operable, but in reality, it's just guesswork. Another criticism of the lack of operability in Lewis's causal theory is, this counterfactual conditional theory of yours can't calculate probabilities. That is, for Lewis's theory, a causal relationship either holds or it doesn't. But in reality, we know, causality isn't black and white like this, rather, it has a certain probability distribution. For example, does smoking cause lung cancer? According to Lewis's counterfactual reasoning, we would ask, if this person did not smoke, would they definitely not get lung cancer? This question doesn't lead to much. Because we know that some people who don't smoke also get lung cancer. And some people, due to genetics or constitution, even if they smoke, they are not very likely to get lung cancer. So, what we should be asking is, does smoking significantly increase the probability of getting lung cancer? And this requires doing some math, it requires the help of statistics. Clearly, Lewis's causal theory did not consider this aspect. This is also the criticism that Judea Pearl, who is coming up next, has of Lewis's causal theory. Due to the lack of mathematical tools, Lewis's causal theory is still not practical enough. And to further make the causal judgment model practical, in the sense of probability and statistics, this is the work of Judea Pearl. Okay, next, let's welcome the Israeli-American computer scientist and philosopher, Judea Pearl. This Judea Pearl is the author of that best-selling book from a few years ago, The Book of Why. This Judea Pearl and David Lewis from the last part, both of them are philosophers. But neither of them is just a pure philosopher, they both have their own main fields of study. Lewis is also a logician. So, his explanation of causality, is the counterfactual conditional given from the level of logic. And Pearl is also a computer scientist, and he is the winner of the 2011 Turing Award. So, as a computer scientist, Pearl strives even more to make the theory of causality practical. To what extent practical? Practical to the point where it can be written into code, to teach computers to understand causality. At the end of the last part, we also mentioned Pearl's criticism of Lewis's causal theory. But, I have to say, Pearl still highly praised Lewis's use of counterfactual conditionals to determine causality. He felt this insight was quite remarkable. But the problem is, using counterfactual conditionals to determine causality is correct in principle, but how do you specifically operate it? On this, Pearl disagreed with Lewis. Lewis's method is to appeal to the closest possible world to see if not A, then not B. This is rather based on guesswork, right? In Pearl's view, you have to use a set of mathematical tools. You have to use probability and statistical methods to calculate the causal probability. That is the truly objective, operable, and testable causal model. Therefore, Pearl himself proposed a definition of causality to replace the simplistic if not A, then not B model for determining causality. The definition of causality that Pearl gave looks like this. Don't be afraid, although it's a mathematical formula, I'll briefly explain it, and it'll be relatively easy to understand. This definition of causality, in plain language, is, if you artificially perform an intervention on X, hey, causing the probability distribution of Y to change, then X is the cause of Y. The key word here is intervention. This definition is actually Pearl's interventional model. If we break this definition down into the interventional model and talk about it piece by piece, you'll understand. Let's first look at the P of Y given X on the far left. We all learned this in middle school. It's the conditional probability. This means, under the condition that X has already occurred, the probability of Y occurring. In fact, what it expresses is, to what probabilistic extent is X the cause of Y, right? For example, to what probabilistic extent does smoking cause lung cancer? We can write it as P of lung cancer given smoking. For example, you are a researcher, currently studying the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. You divide the population into two groups, people who smoke and people who don't smoke. This corresponds to the middle formula, which is X equals smoking, meaning this is the smoking group, and X equals not smoking, meaning this is the non-smoking group. And this capital X equals lowercase x refers to the different states of the event capital X. If capital X is smoking, then lowercase x can refer to smoking and not smoking. If capital X refers to the sun came out, then lowercase x can refer to came out and didn't come out and halfway out. It depends on your time settings. Okay, back to smoking. You observe that the smoker group has a 20% probability of getting lung cancer, and the non-smoker group has a 10% probability of getting lung cancer. So you conclude that smoking causes lung cancer, smoking is the cause of lung cancer. Can you do that? The answer is, you cannot. This conclusion is not reliable. Why? Because if you draw a conclusion purely through observation, you have not ruled out the interference of confounding factors. So what is a confounding factor? This confounding factor is a type of interfering factor. For example, let's look at the diagram below. What we see is, there seems to be a causal relationship between X and Y, that is, X causes Y. But in fact, the actual situation we don't see is, X and Y have a common cause Z. This Z, on the one hand, causes X, and on the other hand, causes Y. This Z is the confounding factor. Z confounds the causal relationship from X to Y. Taking the example of smoking and lung cancer. It's possible that it's not X, smoking, that causes Y, lung cancer. Rather, there is a common cause Z, for example, high stress. People with high stress, on the one hand, are more likely to smoke, and people with high stress, on the other hand, are more likely to get lung cancer. Or, this Z is simply a special gene. People with this gene, on the one hand, are more likely to smoke, and on the other hand, are more likely to get lung cancer. Right, these are all possible. So, an important job of Pearl's interventional model is that when examining causality, you must exclude these confounding factors. Right, if you don't exclude the confounding factor Z, and rashly say smoking causes lung cancer, you are committing a confounding bias in your research. This is the classic correlation does not equal causation problem. So how do we exclude confounding factors? Okay, let's go back to the formulaic expression. You have to intervene, you have to do something, there has to be a do in it. This is the formula on the right. This is the essence of Pearl's interventional model. The middle formula, without do, is called observation, and the right formula, with do, is intervention. So how do you intervene? It means you have to randomly select a population, which includes smokers and non-smokers. You, as the experimenter, do not divide the population according to smoking or not smoking. Rather, you must actively intervene, you have to do something. That is, randomly divide the population into two groups. Then forcibly tell the first group, from now on, you must smoke for me, and force them all to smoke. And forcibly tell the second group, from now on, you cannot smoke a single cigarette, and force them all not to smoke. Then compare the probability distributions of getting lung cancer in the two intervened groups to see what the difference is. Write the probability you get this way as excluded the confounding factors, and only then can you cleanly examine whether there is a causal relationship between X and Y. Of course, forcing subjects to smoke, that kind of experiment definitely cannot be done. I'm just using this example here to help everyone understand this interventional model. Hey, we can take another example. Let's say we want to examine the impact of an elite university degree on a person's income at age 40. Isn't there a saying that if you can't get into an elite university, your salary and benefits will be very low after graduation? Is it really like that? Hey, let's examine the causal relationship here. At this point, you cannot just stay at the observation level. That is, dividing the population into one group of people who went to a top 100 internationally ranked university, and another group of people who went to a 200 to 300 internationally ranked university, and then comparing their incomes at age 40. If you do this, you have not excluded the confounding factors. Because it's possible the conclusion you reached, people who went to elite universities have higher incomes, is because there is this confounding factor Z, for example, good family background. People with good family background are more likely to get into elite universities, and people with good family background are more likely to find high-income jobs. You have to exclude these confounding factors and look purely at the relationship between income and an elite university degree. So, you have to intervene, you have to do something. That is, randomly select a bunch of high school graduates, regardless of their IQ, family background, or whether they are good-looking, randomly divide them into two groups. One group, you artificially make them go to an elite university. The other group, you artificially prevent them from going to an elite university. Then you look at whether there is a significant difference in their incomes at age 40. That way, through intervention, can you truly clarify the causal relationship between elite universities and income. In short, the core essence of this interventional model is that you must actively intervene, not passively observe. Passive observation can only yield correlation. Only active intervention can exclude confounding factors and yield clean causal relationships. Now let's look back at the definition of causality that Pearl gave, and it's clear at a glance. This definition is, if you artificially perform an intervention on X, causing the probability distribution of Y to change, then X is the cause of Y. Of course, Pearl's definition, or interventional model, calculates probability distributions. This involves a lot of statistics. We don't need to go into detail here. In short, this mathematical interventional model, it can calculate specific probability distributions. This is much more operable than Lewis's simple if not A, then not B, and can be used to conduct experiments, right? Pearl, as a computer scientist, one of his great efforts is to teach machines to understand causality. On the foundation of Pearl's interventional model, Pearl further functionalized and algorithmized his causal model, proposing the structural equation model, or SEM, to clearly express how a variable is determined by its causes. We know the famous Bayesian network was proposed and introduced into the field of artificial intelligence by Pearl. In a Bayesian network, the arrows between nodes mainly represent the dependency relationships between conditional probabilities. And Pearl's structural equation model further imbues these arrows with causal meaning. Here, x sub I is a variable in the system, p is sub I is the set of direct cause variables of x sub I, the so-called parent variables, parents, and u sub I represents background noise or other unobservable factors. For artificial intelligence, this kind of causal model is particularly useful. Because mainstream traditional machine learning models are mainly good at finding correlations. But a machine that cannot understand causality cannot truly understand how this world operates. It is precisely in this sense that although Pearl is one of the founders of mainstream traditional machine learning and artificial intelligence, Pearl is now also a fierce critic of mainstream artificial intelligence based on big data statistics. He believes that current mainstream artificial intelligence is only stuck at the observation level we mentioned earlier. It can only understand correlation. And what Pearl wants to do is to enable AI to achieve true intelligence, that is, an AI that can understand causality. And a causal model that can be algorithmized can help AI understand the connection between intervention and outcome. And to make, for example, inferences like, if I do X, will it lead to Y? This kind of AI that can understand causality is very crucial for tasks like machine planning, decision-making, diagnostics, and autonomous driving. In short, Pearl really wants to teach machines to understand causality. Hey, speaking of which, everyone can think back to Kant's view of causality. In Kant's view, causality is a cognitive category in the human cognitive structure. It is a set of cognitive processing programs that the human mind uses when knowing the world. And now with Pearl wants to extract this set of cognitive processing programs that Kant said was unique to humans, formalize it, algorithmize it, write it into code, and teach it to machines, so that machines can also understand causality like humans. A machine that can understand causality, in Pearl's view, in a sense, also possesses free will. What is free will? Humans, of course, possess free will. In Pearl's view, the root of human free will lies precisely in humans possess the ability to conduct counterfactual reasoning. That is, no matter what we humans actually did, we can always imagine, I could have made a different choice. If I hadn't done this, what would have happened? Right, this is the if not A, then not B counterfactual reasoning that Lewis talked about. In Pearl's view, it is precisely because humans have this ability of counterfactual reasoning that they possess free will. Humans can always imagine another possibility. Right, and Pearl has already further formalized Lewis's counterfactual reasoning into the interventional model and the structural equation model. That is to say, free will can also be formalized, algorithmized, and can also be written into code and given to machines. A machine that possesses free will can understand counterfactual questions. For example, an autonomous vehicle makes a decision to turn left. It can also simultaneously evaluate, hey, what if I turn right, would it be safer? When a machine learns to think, I could have made a different choice. When a machine also learns to imagine another possibility, the machine also possesses free will. Which of the theories we discussed above do you like the most? Please write your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for watching this far. Please like, subscribe, and share. Good night, friends.